So me and my friend Dave Griffin, he is working on a movie down here called The Crisis of Missions. You can find out about it at crisisofmissions.com. And we were doing some filming and talking about evangelism, doing evangelism together. And Dave stumbled upon a guy named John McCullough. And John McCullough, he was an open-air preacher in the 1800s. And the way we found it is Dave was looking for, David bought a print of some guy preaching in the open air, a black and white print from the 1800s. And so Dave remembered that the guy was preaching somewhere in Texas, and Dave was in Texas, and so he looks it up. And John McCullough happened to be an open air preacher in Galveston, Texas, 175 years ago. But we started doing more research, and we found out that this guy, John McCullough, he is a reformed open-air preacher. He was part of what's called the old school Presbyterians, meaning that they were opposed to the Finneyism and the revivalism of the 1800s. But he was part of the tradition of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. So he was what's called a New Light, old school Reformed Presbyterian. New Light meaning he was definitely on board with the God-given kind of revival, not revivalism. But anyway, so this guy in the 1830s, he goes into Galveston. This is at the time when Texas just won its independence from Mexico, so it just became a republic. And Galveston at the time was a city filled with pirates and with Roman Catholics. And so, in fact, it was called a stronghold of pirates. And so John McCullough goes into this, at that time, a backwoods, just a pagan land through and through. And he goes into this city and he starts preaching in the open air on the docks there in Galveston, Texas. And lo and behold, eventually he plants a church from the open air preaching. And we got to visit the church. We got to see the same docks where he's preaching from. It's still there today. It's easy to find. And so we started reading more about McCullough. And this guy, he left Galveston to go to other places in Texas. And he just kept preaching. It was said of him that he would preach whenever and wherever he could find a place to do so. And so he's going around Texas. And again, this is in the 1830s. And you're talking Comanche Indians, you're talking, again, pirates in certain communities, but you're talking even just the natural elements that he would have had to face and endure, like swamps and forests and fire and, the cold and sleeping in the marsh and all these things. And he's crossing rivers, and he's doing so with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and churches are being planted as he goes along. And Dave and I got to talking and thinking, and it just goes to show nobody's ever heard of John McCullough. I mean, this guy is someone that we just, by God's grace, happened to dig up. There's nothing really written about him. He has an unmarked grave somewhere in San Antonio, where, by the way, he lived as one of 3 white families in the entire city of San Antonio. And I say that because San Antonio at that time was it was a completely different culture, a completely different language, but he settled there to plant churches, and he did. I mean, through his evangelistic labors and others like him in that area, another church was planted in San Antonio. And so it just goes to show that for all the Martin Luthers and John Calvins and George Whitefields and Jonathan Edwards, there are hundreds of men who brought the gospel to the West and to America, not always from the pulpit, which is good. That's certainly a good and biblical means of conveying the gospel. But a lot of these men, they were men who were taking the gospel to these frontier towns, to these places where no foot had ever trod, to these places that, not just the pirates and the Roman Catholics, but even the natural elements, and they were hungry to see God glorified. And these were Reformed guys. These were Calvinists doing this. And one thing that we thought about was And this is something that I've thought of for a while. 100 years from now, I'm convinced that historians are going to look upon our era in America, and they're going to see that there's a lot of open-air preaching being done in America and in England and in Scotland, Ireland, Wales. And what's unique about this is, so there was a guy who reached out to me on YouTube one time, and he said that he's writing a book on the street preaching movement. And I was kind of taken aback because I'd never really considered, I guess, street preaching to be a movement. I have heard pastors say that 30 years ago, nobody was street preaching. The guys who are like 70 and 80 now, they would say 30 years ago, nobody was preaching. 40 years ago, nobody street preaching, maybe like one or two guys. Whereas now they're in every city, they're in even small towns have them. And so, of course, that comes with problems because there are a lot of unbiblical forms of open air preaching that's being done right now. But at the same time, the fact that it's being done, I'm just convinced that years from now, historians are going to look back and they're going to see something when it comes to open air preaching. And I'm saying this because God is doing something. God, I don't know what it is necessarily. He could be, this could be like a call of judgment to this nation and to England and to Scotland, and that's why he's raising up so many open air preachers. Maybe, optimistically, maybe he's going to bring revival through means like this, and of course, healthy preaching from the pulpit and things like that. But the point is this: there are a lot of unsung heroes in the history of the church, and that's the way that, rightly so, that's the way that God has appeared to do things. And the takeaway is this: in our era, open-air preachers are unsung. They are not popular. They're not going to be at your big conferences and things like that. And I think that's a good thing, probably. That we don't have to fight some of that temptation that other guys might have to fight. But it is to say that we have a reason to continue doing so. And we have guys like John McCullough who did it not for recognition, not for fame, not even for what we might do with later, like me and Dave finding John McCullough and talking about him right here on this video. That's not why John McCullough was doing things. But it is really neat to know that God has a lot of laborers in the harvest. We're not necessarily behind pulpits, not necessarily seminary trained, not necessarily polished and neat and tidy and doing everything by the books necessarily, but they are men of action. They are bulls in the china shop, and God uses them to do things. And so while we would advocate, open air preachers being part of a local church and serving the church and doing things in context of churches and doing things, of course, biblically, lovingly, gently. Doesn't mean you can't preach with intensity and passion, but as far as just our demeanors go. But it is to say that God uses the foolishness of men. He uses the weakest to confound the wise, the dumbest to confound the wise. But John McCullough was a really neat find for us, and I think 100 years from now there'll be guys. I can think of like 20 right off the bat who are doing something similar to what John McCullough was doing in our own context. They're out there preaching the gospel. They're at abortion clinics. They're fighting the good fight of faith across the world. And so these are heroes, not in the worldly sense, and not even in the sense of elevating them, even for a video like this, but to demonstrate that God is using unsung heroes to advance His gospel and to advance His kingdom. That's why we have churches in America. By and large, they were planted by men like John McCullough, who was risking his life and his family's life to to preach the gospel to pirates. I mean, how cool is that? So if you're looking for guys like John McCullough, more information on those guys, The Crisis of Missions, this movie that Dave's working on, it's going to bring to light a lot of this more undercover, this behind the scenes kind of activity, gospel activity that God was doing, not only in the 1800s, but even before then and throughout church history. And so it's definitely a movie. It's going to be a film to watch and to be encouraged by, and not only practically speaking, but just to learn about and to recall some of these guys that God used to advance the gospel throughout the West. And so check it out at thecrisisofmissions.com, thecrisisofmissions.com, and you'll see the trailer there, and you'll see some other footage there. But check it out, support it, pray for it, pray for Dave. And you know, this isn't necessarily, it's certainly not about Dave or about us. In fact, Dave doesn't want to be in it at all. Very humble, right? But it's about seeing the gospel of Jesus Christ advanced in the 21st century Western Hemisphere and around the world, using biblical means to do so. So you'll definitely want to check it out, and you'll be able to see what John McCullough looked like and where he preached. We filmed some drone footage and other things like that. So it'll be really neat. So check it out, thecrisisofmissions.com.